I want to talk very briefly about, to just give a bit of context to the whole event in terms of what's happening with the mining boom in Australia. Over the last few days there's been a conference at the Hilton Hotel just over the bridge in the CBD called the Galilee Basin Coal and Energy Conference. The expansion of the coal industry in the Galilee Basin is expected, if all of the mines get up and go ahead that are proposed, will be about 300 million tonnes of coal mined and exported a year, or at least that amount. That's roughly equivalent to Australia's entire coal exports at the moment, and Australia is the largest seaborne coal exporter in the world. So that one area is an absolutely will have a huge is a huge expansion of coal mining in Australia. But that's only part of the story, of course. So this blue bar on the graph actually represents all the mining in central Queensland, so the Bowen and Galilee basins at the moment, and that's about 60 operating coal mines, and it's about 180 million tonnes a year. So a significant proportion of the amount of coal that Australia currently exports. So what that blue bar represents is something that's already absolutely enormous. Over the next 5 years, the proposed mines would roughly quadruple that. So that stack is all the mines that are proposed over the next few years. And I guess it's just really to give people a sense of the scale of what's going on at the moment. Coal isn't the only thing that's going on in mining. The gas expansion is equally as huge. Currently, we're the 5th largest gas exporter in the world. Qatar is the largest. We export about 20 million tonnes of liquefied natural gas every year. So that's export of liquefied natural gas, as in seaborne gas. Within the next decade, that'll increase about 5-fold, and we'll overtake Qatar as the largest LNG exporter in the world. So I guess the point really is that all of these projects, are going to have, it's so huge that it's going to have a big impact on a whole lot of things, from the climate through to water tables and agricultural land and all sorts of things. But because it's so enormous, it's also going to have a huge impact on the economy, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Because mining crowds out other sectors of the economy primarily through driving up the exchange rate, driving up labour costs, it impacts quite heavily on other sectors, particularly export sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, tourism and education. And we're lucky enough to have here with us tonight Nina Murray, who's the Grains Director at AgForce, and Andrew Detmer, who's the National President of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. So it's really great to get perspectives of people who are actually in these industries at the front line of these effects to give those industries perspective. And we've got Richard Dennis, who will speak first, and he'll be able to talk in more detail about those things that I've touched on, but also introduce some new research the Australia Institute has done specifically on the impact of the high Australian dollar on farmers' income through agricultural income. So that's very specific and really interesting area that he'll be able to talk about. Richard will speak first, and then we'll hear from Nina and Andrew, and then we'll have about at least half an hour of Q&A after that, so which is always great because I'm sure people have lots of questions they want to ask. So I'd just like to everyone to welcome Richard Dennis, the Director of the Australia Institute. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and look, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and thanks to my fellow panellists for sacrificing some after work time to come and talk about what I think is one of the biggest issues that the country faces, and as I'll make a case in the next few minutes, I think it's one of the biggest. I think it's one of the most poorly understood, and thanks to you guys for being interested in that. It's really quite an impressive layout here, Mark. Lots of pretty pictures to look at. I'm of the view that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, but it's nice that Mark's popped up some slides so that you can get a sense of the enormity of what's proposed. Let's be clear about that. It's proposed. It hasn't happened yet. It's actually up to us as a society whether we want it to happen or not. It's democracy. We don't always get what we want, but someone gets what they want and someone misses out. And this is what some people want. And that's okay. There are arguments for why they should want it. There's certainly some money to be made. But what you can't deny, and nobody can deny, is that if that coal expansion that Mark talked about occurs, and if this gas expansion occurs, there will be fundamental macroeconomic impacts on other sectors. Now, the mining industry is very good at talking up the benefits of its activity, and there are benefits of its activity, particularly for the mining industry. Right? We can't blame them for doing that, but while they're very quick to take credit for the indirect jobs they create, the indirect benefits, they're very reluctant to take responsibility for the indirect damage they do. And the main way that they damage other sectors of the economy, as I'll talk about tonight, is through the exchange rate. But before I talk about that, I just want to use words to expand on what Mark showed you with pictures. I just want you to get a sense of how big the mining boom is. In Australia today, we pull up around over 400 million tonnes of coal a year. No one can understand what 400 million tonnes of coal looks like, so let me help explain it. If you had a 400 million tonne pile of coal, you could make a pile of coal a metre deep, about as deep as that table, 10 metres wide, a road, 40,000 kilometres long. You could get around the world on a road of coal, a metre deep, with 1 year's coal output from Australia. Now, the Queensland expansion alone is an extra 300 million tonnes. And that would make, so 400 plus 300, there's 700 million tonnes. That's a pile of coal a metre deep, 10 metres wide, 70,000 kilometres long. About twice around the world. But Australia-wide, the plan is to be digging up about 1 billion tonnes of coal per year, which would get you around the world about 3 times, or put another way, picture a pile of coal a metre by a metre to the moon and back. That's 1 year's coal output under these optimistic scenarios. Now, if you've heard anything about climate change, you might want to use the word optimistic for that, but I'm not here to talk about climate change tonight. I'm talking about what digging up that much more coal and selling it is going to do to the rest of the economy. Now, before I do that, I just want to make one last point to get the scale of this. Australia is the largest exporter of coal in the world. We actually have a larger share of the world traded coal market than the Saudis have of the world oil market. We have a bigger share of the world coal market than they have of the world oil market. Now, I don't know if you've heard of OPEC, but the Saudis had this great idea in the 70s that the way to get rich was to not sell all their oil. It was to hang on to it, to form a cartel, to restrict the supply of oil, and then sell less of it at a higher price. Now in Australia, Clive Palmer, Nathan Tinkler, and a bunch of much smarter people than the Saudis have had the exact opposite idea. They think we need to dig it all up in the next 10 years and sell it as quick as we can. Now, one of us has got the exact wrong strategy. It could be the billionaires in the robes, or it could be Nathan Tinkler and Clive Palmer and the other bunch of people that want to dig up all the coal really quickly. But let's be really clear, the Saudis think the way to get rich is to leave it in the ground and eke it outside. And we've convinced ourselves that the way to get rich is to dig it all up at once and sell it in the biggest race we've ever seen. One of us is wrong. My money's on us, unfortunately. So that's some sense of how big this mining boom is. If you think the Saudis can influence the world oil price, well, you better believe us trebling our output will influence the world coal price. We're going to push the price of our own raw materials down, not up. And in doing that, in flooding the market with our coal, exporting that much coal pushes up our exchange rate. Now the exchange rate, people get confused about exchange rates. You see them on the news every night. Has it ever occurred to you that you're watching the news at night and there it is, the Nikkei down and the Hang Seng exchange rate? No one's got any idea what any of that means. And the only people who need to know that, do you really think that the stockbrokers are tuning into the Channel 10 News to find out what happened? What's it doing there? It's confusing people. But every night you hear about the exchange rate. All an exchange rate means is the price at which you can swap one thing for another. So if milk costs $1 and bread costs $2, then you can exchange 2 litres of milk for 1 loaf of bread. Exchange rate just means if we were going to swap, how many of my thing can I get for your thing? So when we talk about currency exchange rates, the Australian US dollar exchange rate, let's say at the moment, it's a bit over this, but one Australian dollar buys 104 US cents. What that means is if I've got 1 Australian dollar, someone will give me 104 US cents. Now, 2004, if I had 1 Australian dollar, I could buy about 60 US cents. So once upon a time, going to America was an expensive place to go on a holiday. Once upon a time, buying a German car was an expensive thing to do. Once upon a time, buying anything imported was far more expensive than it used to be, because now 1 Australian dollar buys a lot more of those other currencies. 2004, as I said, exchange rate around 65 cents. Today, more than $1.05. Now, there's 2 reasons. Sorry, I won't bore you with economics for too long. You've got to get this point. There's 2 main reasons that selling lots of exports drives up our exchange rate. Or selling lots of coal drives up exchange rate. Selling lots of coal, other countries, in order to buy Australian coal, have to first buy Australian dollars, and that increases the demand for Australian dollars and the price goes up. Now, people in Australia understand that when we all want to buy something at the same time, the price goes up. My favourite example is prawns. Every Christmas, the price of prawns goes through the roof. Why? Because we all decided about 10 years ago that there's nothing more traditional than eating lots of prawns at Christmas time. We used to think maybe eating turkey, that didn't really take off, chicken was a bit hot, so we settled on the tradition, and buying prawns was it. Now the problem is the prawns aren't in on it. They don't understand it's Christmas. They don't get the significance of Christmas. So they're just swimming around being prawns, breeding at the same rate, growing at the same rate, and then every Christmas we all treble our demand for it. And when we all want to buy more prawns, there's no more prawns around, the price of prawns goes up. Well, that's what happens when the rest of the world wants to buy our currency. And they need to buy our currency to buy our coal. They also need to buy our currency if they want to come and build massive new mines here. And that's called capital inflow. So if we're going to build all those mines or even all these gas developments, these are foreign-owned, 83% foreign-owned. The industry is 83% foreign-owned. The money to build them is flooding into Australia at the moment. Now it's slowed down a bit. Right? You might have heard that the heat has come out of the boom. Well, it has. But it's still far more money flowing in than 10 years ago. And all that money flowing in increases demand for our currency. Exchange rate goes up. So what? Cheap overseas holidays, cheap imported cars. What's to complain about? Well, maybe nothing. Except if you're an Australian producer of something that's trying to either export or compete with imported things. So we've got some new research out today that says that if the Australian exchange rate was 70 cents today, it's not. more like $1.04. 70 cents is the long run historic average. If the exchange rate was about 70 cents, then farmers selling wheat and beef and sugar and all the things that they sell would be about $15 billion a year better off than they are at today's exchange rate. So think of it this way, I'll just make the maths really simple. If the exchange rate used to be 50 cents, and it's been lower than that, the Australian dollar fell to 45 cents US at one point. But if the Australian dollar was buying 50 cents US, if you had one American dollar, if you sold your beef you sold a kilo of beef into the market for $1 American, if the exchange rate was 50 cents, you could take that $1 American and swap it for $2 Australian dollars. But if the exchange rate goes to parity, you sell your beef for $1 US, you can swap it for $1 Australian dollar. So you're getting half as much money. Australian agricultural exporters, as I said, if the exchange rate was 70 cents, would be $15 billion a year better off. If the exchange rate was 90 cents, which would be a record high, then they'd be $4.5 billion better off. So the higher the dollar is, the more money our farmers lose. Manufacturing, and we all know the car industry is in trouble. Well, it's in trouble for a simple reason. Imported cars are really cheap because the Australian dollar buys so many more Japanese yen than it used to. It buys so many more American dollars, it buys so many more, I've forgotten what Korean currency is. You know, something like that. One? Alright, our dollar is strong against their currencies, which means you can go and buy a brand new car in Australia for $13,000. That's cheap. Turn that around, if you're making Commodores and Falcons and you're trying to export them to those same countries, they're twice as dear as they were 10 years ago. So, and finally the tourism industry. I used this example today. I was in Fiji earlier this year. In the hotel I was staying in 1 week, there were 2 Australian weddings in Fiji. 80 guests each. Middle class people with 80 of their closest friends flying overseas to have a wedding. That didn't happen when the exchange rate was 65 cents. Now, I don't know if you know this scam, but the other reason for that, and it's mainly the exchange rate that makes it affordable, is it's basically a way for the bride and groom to rip off all of their friends and family. Because they never tell you this, that they get a free wedding. They get a free room, they get free everything, the catering's dirt cheap, they just put all the costs onto you. And the hotel loves it because they get 80 guests, all because the bride and groom are staying there. So next time you get invited to one of those things, just ask the bride and groom for some money. But again, it wouldn't work. It didn't work when the exchange rate was that low. So what's happening in Australia at the moment is, and this surprises most people, we are not having an export boom in Australia. Let me just say that again. Australia's not having an export boom. Our current account deficit is actually quite high, and we are not having an export boom. What we're having is a mining export boom, and the non-mining industries, their exports are falling. We have replaced agricultural exports, manufacturing exports, tourism exports with mining exports. We've swapped one for the other. Now, if you've seen any of the ads on television about the mining boom, you might have missed that. Because they're very good at saying, look at all the exports we're generating. But they very rarely, and by rarely I mean never, mention the fact that their mining exports have driven the exchange rate up and has pushed everybody else's exports down. So what we're doing is creating quite an unbalanced economy. An economy where a much bigger proportion of our economic activity is exposed to the very volatile mining industry. But even though it represents a large and growing proportion of our GDP, it employs almost no one. The mining industry employs around 2% of Australians, less than 2% here in Queensland. I can't remember, my guess would be about 1.5, 1.7. Put another way, 98% of Australians don't work in mining. The vast majority of us don't. Manufacturing employs 8 times as many people as mining. Retail employs 10 times as many. That's what a big industry looks like. But the mining industry is literally crowding out those other activities. How am I going for time, Mark? 4 minutes, perfect. See, because I don't have PowerPoint, I always finish on time. Let me just make one last point about, and it's in the, if you haven't got it, there's a little summary fact sheet floating around, and all of the Australia Institute's work is available for free online, and all of this can be found in more detail there. But someone asked me just before I spoke about one of the things that it says on the fact sheet, and that is that even though mining is 83% foreign owned, 83% of the profits the mining companies make from our resources is exported. All of that activity counts in GDP. All of the profit, 100% of the profit, is included in our GDP, even though only 13% of it stays here. Now that's not, no one's defrauding anybody, but no one really understands what gross domestic product means. Gross domestic product, GDP. It's product, stuff we make domestically within our borders. So as long as the activity takes place here in our borders, the ABS counts that in GDP. The fact that 830 million out of every $1 billion in profit goes to the foreign owners of the holes in the ground is irrelevant when we calculate GDP. It's not irrelevant for the well-being of Australian citizens, but it is irrelevant for the way we measure GDP. And to freak you out slightly more, you'll often hear people say that we export the profits. It's worse than that. We don't export the profits of mining. They never come here. Because when a Chinese steel mill buys $1 billion worth of coal off Xstrata, a Swiss-owned mining company, where do you think the Chinese post the cheque to? Seriously? They don't send it here. Why would a Chinese steel mill post a cheque for $1 billion to Australia? We don't own it. They own it. The $1 billion cheque goes to Switzerland. A much smaller cheque then comes from Switzerland to Australia to pay a few wages and do whatever it is they do. So we talk about exporting the profits. It's worse than that. The money doesn't even touch our shores. So, to conclude, I don't think we should shut the mining industry down, and I certainly don't think we should shut it down tomorrow. But as a country, we've got some massive questions to ask ourselves in the next couple of years. One of them is, do we want to see all of these mines built simultaneously? Because if we do, the consequences for the exchange rate, let alone for the atmosphere, are going to be catastrophic. And secondly, if we don't think that that's the kind of country we want, if we don't want to live in a country where manufacturing and agriculture and tourism continue to freefall, what are we going to do about it? And the worst question, and this is a deliberate question invented by the mining industry, the worst question to think of is, well, should we shut the mining industry down or should we let it rip? It's a deliberately nonsensical question, because the mining industry just wants to be left alone to make a fortune and post it back overseas. You know, post it metaphorically. Really, as a country, we need to say, well, look, we need to think in the middle here. No one's saying shut it down tomorrow, but this let it rip stuff is literally destroying segments of agriculture, segments of manufacturing, segments of tourism. How, if at all, do we want to intervene? And our politicians, state and federal, Labor, Liberal, all of them, are dodging this hard question by asking a silly question. Do you want to shut it down or do you want to let it rip? And I think we have to start asking those politicians a much harder question. how are you going to make sure we can keep the Australian economy more balanced? How do we not bet the house on a mining boom that history tells us will bust one day? And when the mining boom busts, agriculture won't pick up straight away, especially if you've trashed the land. Manufacturing won't pick up straight away, especially if the factories have gone offshore. So we've got some big questions that we need to ask, but we need to avoid that silly question, because that silly question of let it rip or shut it down is designed to stop us having a sensible conversation. Thank you very much.